Grant Holloway was gone for only 3 days. When he came home, every piece of furniture he owned was thrown out onto the front lawn, ruined in the rain, and a sign reading "Sold" stood staked into the grass by his own front door. A stranger stood in his doorway holding a new set of keys. The woman behind it all, Celeste Wainwright, told him with total calm that the house was no longer his, that she had turned a stack of fabricated fines into a lien and quietly sold his home to a man she controlled. What she did not know was exactly who she had just robbed or what he was about to do to her. Before that morning, no one on the street had warned him. Grant had driven back from a 3-day business trip to a neighboring town, tired but unbothered, expecting nothing more than an empty house and a stack of mail. As his truck turned onto his own street, he noticed neighbors standing outside their front doors watching his driveway, in total silence, the way people watch a car accident they are too afraid to speak about out loud. When he pulled into his own driveway, he did not understand what he was looking at for several seconds. His leather sofa sat crooked in the wet grass. His oak dining table lay on its side. File boxes had split open in the rain, and shirts and jackets were scattered across the yard, like the aftermath of a storm that had only hit his property and no one else's. The front door had a brand new lock bolted into it, one he had never installed and never approved. Before he could reach for his phone, a man he had never met stepped out from behind the garage and told him almost cheerfully that the house now belonged to him, that he had purchased it fair and square at a foreclosure auction run by the Community Association. That man's name was Nathaniel Crow, and he spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had said those exact words before to someone else standing in someone else's yard. Grant asked him to repeat himself, not because he had misheard, but because some part of him needed a second confirmation that this nightmare was actually real, and not some elaborate misunderstanding that would resolve itself in the next 5 minutes. Celeste arrived a moment later, with her treasurer Darlene Prescott and her personal attorney Russell Vane walking beside her like a small procession of executioners who had come to read a verdict rather than deliver one. Celeste was dressed as if she were attending a luncheon rather than standing on a stranger's ruined lawn, and she carried a thick folder of documents that she held up like a trophy. She informed Grant that he owed the association $47,600 in unpaid fines, a number so specific it sounded almost official, almost believable, exactly the way a lie is built to sound when someone has had months to rehearse it. The fines, she said, had accumulated over violations he had supposedly ignored for more than a year. The list she read aloud sounded almost comedic in its pettiness, and yet the consequences attached to it were anything but a joke. There was a fine for a garage door painted the wrong shade of gray, a fine for a car parked at what she called an unauthorized angle in his own driveway, a fine for a sprinkler system running 4 minutes past its permitted schedule, a fine for a fence that exceeded the association's height limit by less than an inch. There were fines for missing 3 mandatory community meetings he had never been informed about, and on top of all of it, months of accumulated legal fees and interest that had ballooned the original complaints into a number large enough to justify seizing his entire home. Grant told her calmly, and without raising his voice, that he had never received a single one of those notices, not by mail, not by email, not by any method that could reasonably be called proper communication. Celeste simply pointed to a signature at the bottom of one of her documents and told him that all procedures had already been completed according to the association's bylaws. When Grant asked to call the police, Russell stepped forward with the flat, bored tone of a man who had said this line 100 times before, explaining that this was a private civil dispute and that law enforcement had no jurisdiction over property matters handled internally by a homeowners association. Celeste stepped closer to him, then close enough that her voice dropped into something almost intimate, almost kind, though nothing behind her eyes matched the softness of her words. She told him that a person could not live inside a community if that person refused to submit to the rules the community had agreed upon. Grant did not answer her. Instead, he bent down and picked up one of the file boxes lying open in the grass. Its plastic latch snapped clean off, its contents half soaked from the previous night's rain. Inside that box, he had once kept the original deed to his home, the physical document proving decades of ownership passed down through his family. That document was gone. He stood back up slowly, looked directly at Celeste, and asked her a single question, in a voice that had gone completely flat, completely controlled the voice of a man doing math in his head rather than feeling anything at all. He asked her which certificate of ownership she had used to authorize the sale of his home. For a fraction of a second, the confident smile on Celeste's face went rigid, as if some small crack had opened behind her eyes, but she quickly smoothed it back over into practiced composure. That night, Grant checked into a small roadside motel a few miles outside the neighborhood, carrying with him only the documents that had survived the rain and a laptop bag he had kept in his truck out of habit. Before his early retirement, Grant had spent 2 decades as a public asset auditor, a job that had trained him to recognize forged ownership records, rigged auctions, and money quietly funneled through shell companies designed to look legitimate on paper. He was not, as Celeste assumed, a helpless homeowner who would simply accept a loss and move away quietly. He was, without her realizing it, one of the very few people in that entire county capable of unraveling exactly what she had built. He spent the following 2 days going through every scrap of correspondence he could find, checking his email archive, his mailbox history, and the association's online payment portal for any record of the fines Celeste claimed he owed. There was nothing there, not a single notice sent through any of the required legal channels, not one certified letter, not one formal warning that met even the loosest definition of proper procedure. When Grant pulled up the county property records system, he discovered that a lien had been quietly filed against his home 8 months earlier, long before any of this had become visible to him. The details of that lien did not add up under even the lightest scrutiny. The mailing address listed for notifications was not his address at all, but a post office box registered somewhere across town. The signature attached to the receipt of service looked suspiciously identical across 3 separate documents, as though it had been copied rather than signed by hand each time. The notary information belonged to a man who had let his commission expire nearly 2 years earlier, meaning every stamp on those papers was legally worthless. The date on the primary filing placed it during a week. Grant had been attending an out-of-state conference, a trip he could prove with hotel receipts and flight records. And the auction that had supposedly sold his house had taken place only 19 days after the final notice was claimed to have been delivered far faster than any legitimate foreclosure timeline allowed. Grant reached out to Claudia Baines, a title examiner with the county recorder's office who had helped him verify property records years earlier during his auditing career. Claudia confirmed that on paper the filing looked technically valid inside the digital system, but she noticed something Grant had missed. The original documents had been submitted in person rather than through the county's standard electronic filing portal, an unusual choice for any legitimate transaction of that size. The person who had physically delivered those papers was Russell Vane. Claudia also told him something that made his stomach turn cold. Nathaniel Crow had purchased the home for $126,000. Despite the property's fair market value sitting close to $640,000 a gap. So enormous, it could not be explained by any honest DA. Foreclosure sale. Even more troubling that money had not gone into any of the association's normal operating accounts. It had been routed instead into a special fund with an almost civic-sounding name, one designed to sound generous and community-minded rather than what it actually was. That fund was called the Briarcrest Community Restoration Fund, and according to the paperwork Claudia pulled, it was managed jointly by Darlene Prescott as treasurer, with Celeste Wainwright holding final signing authority over every transaction that passed through it. Grant realized in that moment that what had happened to him was not an overzealous association enforcing overly strict rules. It was something far more deliberate, far more organized, and far more dangerous than a simple dispute over fines and fences. Claudia sent him something else before they ended the call, a document she had pulled almost as an afterthought, a list of every property the Briarcrest Homeowners Association had seized and resold over the past 4 years. Grant stared at the number at the bottom of that list for a long time before he could bring himself to believe it. 11 homes. 11 families who had gone through some version of exactly what had just happened to him. Over the next several days, Grant traced that list of 11 addresses, cross-referencing names, dates, and sale prices, searching for anyone who might still live close enough to talk to in person. Many of the former owners had already left the county entirely scattered to cheaper apartments or relatives' spare bedrooms after losing homes that had once represented most of their life savings. One name stopped him cold when he found it, a man named Wesley Trent, who, according to the records, had once lived only 2 streets away from Grant's own house before losing everything 3 years earlier. Grant found Wesley living in a modest rental complex on the far side of town, the kind of building people ended up in after losing something much larger. When Grant introduced himself and explained what had just happened to his own home, Wesley's first instinct was fear rather than sympathy, a flinch that suggested Celeste's reach had followed him even after he had lost everything, and moved away. It was only after Grant showed him copies of his own fraudulent lien documents that Wesley's guarded expression finally softened into something closer to recognition. Wesley's story unfolded slowly, the details still clearly painful even 3 years later. He had been fined for a roof color the association claimed did not match approved materials, despite the fact that the association itself had signed off on those exact materials before the repair work began. The fine started small, around $900, but ballooned within months to more than $31,000 once legal fees and compounding interest were added on top. Celeste had personally offered him a way out, suggesting he simply sign a voluntary sale agreement rather than fight the fines in court. When Wesley refused that offer, the association used its manufactured lien to force his home into auction, a house worth roughly $510,000 sold for only $98,000. The buyer that day had not been an individual at all, but a company called North Alder Holdings, a name that meant nothing to Wesley at the time but meant everything once Grant later cross-referenced it against public business filings. That company had been registered through a virtual office address with no real physical presence, and its listed legal representative was unsurprisingly Russell Vane. Wesley revealed something even more damning during that same conversation. Frightened and desperate in the months after losing his home, he had quietly filmed Celeste and Darlene loading boxes of documents out of the association's office late at night, long after regular business hours had ended. He had also kept copies of internal community newsletters that, when read, carefully revealed a pattern in exactly which homes the association targeted for enforcement action. The properties chosen tended to share several traits in common, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. The homes targeted were almost always high in market value. Their owners tended to live alone without a spouse or family nearby to help fight back. They typically had little or no remaining mortgage balance, meaning a sale would produce a large lump sum rather than simply paying off a bank. Their owners often had few close relatives, still living in the area, who might notice something was wrong. And critically, they were people the association judged unlikely to have the legal knowledge or financial resources to mount a serious defense. Grant realized with a slow sinking certainty that he matched every single one of those criteria except the last one, the one Celeste had gotten fatally wrong. She had assumed he was simply another retired homeowner with no particular expertise, no idea how to read a fraudulent filing, no background that would let him see through the paperwork she had built. She had no idea that the very career she assumed made him easy to overlook was the exact career that had trained him to recognize every trick she was using against him. Grant asked Wesley to formally join whatever legal action might eventually be filed. Wesley hesitated for a long moment, clearly still afraid of what Celeste and her allies were capable of, but eventually agreed to hand over his video footage, his old email correspondence, and copies of every fraudulent fine notice he had kept from those years. Grant began reaching out carefully to the other families on Claudia's list, contacting them one by one over the following week. 6 agreed to cooperate once they understood they were not alone. 3 declined outright, still too frightened of retaliation to risk speaking up. 2 others could not be located at all. Before Grant left that afternoon, Wesley handed him an envelope that had accidentally been delivered to his old address months after he had already moved away, a piece of misdirected mail that had somehow never made its way back to the sender. Inside was a printed list of 23 property addresses, clearly some kind of internal planning document, rather than anything meant for public eyes. Grant's own address was highlighted in red ink near the top of the page. Beside it, in smaller handwriting, someone had written a short note that made his blood run cold. Priority processing before the 4th quarter. Rather than retreat after learning she was being questioned, Celeste moved to consolidate control before anyone could organize against her. She called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association to address what she framed as growing confusion around the sale of Grant's home. When Grant arrived to attend in person, private security hired for the occasion turned him away at the door, informing him coldly that he no longer qualified as a legitimate resident of the community he had lived in for years. Celeste streamed the meeting to every household in the neighborhood, painting Grant as a chronic rule-breaker who had refused to pay dues and had tried repeatedly to destabilize the community's order. Russell displayed documents on a projector screen bearing what appeared to be Grant's own signature images, convincing enough that several residents in the audience nodded along, accepting the story at face value, simply because the paperwork looked official. Celeste went further still, warning openly that anyone who chose to support Grant's claims would find their own property records placed under review for possible violations of their own. It was a threat wrapped in the language of community standards, but everyone in that room understood exactly what she meant by it. A local investigative reporter named Simone Barrett approached Grant outside the meeting hall afterward, having spent months quietly tracking a pattern of suspiciously cheap foreclosure auctions throughout Briarcrest without ever finding a victim willing to speak openly about it. Grant was cautious with her at first, not because he distrusted her intentions, but because he understood that going public too early before he had solid proof of where the money had actually gone could destroy his credibility before the truth had a chance to matter. He needed to trace the money first, not just the paperwork. While Grant worked quietly in the background, Nathaniel began renovating the stolen house with the clear intention of flipping it for a quick profit. Workers hired by Nathaniel threw more of Grant's remaining possessions into a dumpster parked in the driveway, and fixtures Grant had installed himself over the years were ripped out and discarded without a second thought. When Grant returned to the property simply to collect whatever belongings might still remain, Celeste had security called on him, accusing him outright of criminal trespassing on land that was, according to her paperwork, no longer his to enter. Deputy Monica Hale arrived at the scene to handle the trespassing complaint, and Celeste immediately demanded that Grant be arrested on the spot. Monica reviewed the property documents presented to her and confirmed that current legal ownership did appear to rest with Nathaniel Crowe, but something about the paperwork's timeline struck her as inconsistent, even on a quick read. Grant quietly showed her away from Celeste's line of sight. The signature comparison and notary discrepancies he had already compiled over the previous days. Monica could not simply hand the house back to Grant on the spot. The legal process did not work that way, but she agreed to forward the documentation to the department's fraud investigation unit for a closer look. Celeste overheard part of that exchange and could not resist a final jab, telling Grant flatly that the authorities had already reviewed everything they needed to review, and that he no longer had a home, no longer had any legal standing, and would soon have no reputation left in the community either. That same evening, Celeste sent Grant a written offer through Russell's office, proposing $25,000 in exchange for his agreement to drop all claims and leave the county quietly for good. Grant read the offer twice before responding with a single sentence that he sent back through the same channel. He told her that she had just priced her own confession far too cheap. Grant spent the following days combing through publicly available financial disclosures the association was legally required to file each year, comparing reported income against actual bank activity wherever records existed. The fund, labeled as the Community Restoration Fund, had taken in millions of dollars over its lifetime, yet almost none of that money had ever been spent on anything resembling actual community improvement. Over 4 years, the association had collected roughly $3,800,000 through home sales, legal fees, and escalating fines, a figure that dwarfed any legitimate operating budget a neighborhood association of that size should have needed. That money had been quietly redirected in several directions, each one leading back to the same small circle of people. Large sums flowed to North Alder Holdings, the shell company used to disguise Nathaniel's straw purchases. Other payments went to a consulting business registered under Darlene's name, and still more to Russell's law office, under vaguely worded invoices for undefined legal services. A landscaping company owned by Celeste's own brother had received regular payments despite performing almost no visible work on association property, and a significant portion had gone toward deposits on vacation real estate purchased in Celeste's name alone. The most damning discovery came when Grant traced deposit payments on 3 high-value homes sitting inside Briarcrest itself, purchased using money drawn directly from association accounts. 2 of those homes belonged to Celeste and Darlene personally. The third belonged to Russell, though it had been carefully purchased through yet another shell company to keep his name off the public deed. In other words, the money stolen from families who had lost their homes had been used to buy new homes for the very people responsible for taking theirs away. Simone independently verified much of this through corporate filing records and began quietly assembling what would eventually become her first published investigation into the scheme. Monica sought a formal subpoena to access the association's banking records directly, but Russell fought the request aggressively, claiming the documents fell under attorney-client privilege and could not legally be compelled. Grant found the flaw in that argument almost immediately. The fund was not a private legal account at all, but a community trust account, and under state law, its transactions were required to be disclosed to residents upon request. Darlene, sensing the walls closing in around her, realized Grant was getting dangerously close to the full truth. She reached out to him privately, offering to hand over a portion of her records in exchange for some form of immunity from prosecution. Grant made her no promises he was not authorized to make, and instead urged her directly to take her information straight to Monica's investigative unit before it was too late for her to matter as anything other than a co-PA. Conspirator. Before Darlene could follow through on that conversation, Celeste moved first. She called an emergency vote among the remaining loyal board members and had Darlene formally removed from her position as treasurer, cutting off her access to association records entirely. Celeste then had the association's physical office quietly cleared out over the following weekend, presumably to remove anything that might still connect her directly to the fraud. What Celeste did not know was that Darlene, anticipating exactly this outcome, had already copied the entire accounting database onto a personal hard drive days earlier. On that hard drive, investigators would later find a spreadsheet with a chillingly clinical title. It was labeled simply as the Acquisition Schedule, a running list of targeted properties updated over several years. The final row on that list listed Grant's own address in plain text. In the column marked as ultimate beneficiary, a single name appeared without any ambiguity at all: Celeste Wainwright. With that spreadsheet in hand, Grant and Monica turned their attention fully toward Nathaniel Crowe, whose name appeared as the buyer on 4 of the 11 fraudulent sales uncovered so far. Nathaniel had always presented himself publicly as an independent real estate investor, working entirely on his own initiative, but a closer look at his personal finances revealed he simply did not have the resources to fund purchases of that size on his own. Someone else had clearly been backing every single one of his transactions from behind the scenes. Bank records showed that deposit funds used to secure each property were wired into Nathaniel's account only 2 days before each scheduled auction money that traced directly back to North Alder Holdings. After each house was renovated and resold at full market value, Nathaniel kept roughly 8% of the profit for himself as a fee for playing the role of buyer, while the remainder was quietly split between Celeste Russell and Darlene according to an arrangement none of them had ever put in writing where it could be found. When Monica formally questioned him, Nathaniel initially denied any wrongdoing, insisting he had simply been a savvy investor taking advantage of publicly available auction listings. Grant methodically dismantled that story point by point. He noted that auction notices had been placed in a small, largely defunct local paper that almost no one still read. He pointed out that auction locations were mysteriously changed at the last possible moment. Other interested bidders were consistently given incorrect addresses or times, ensuring they never actually showed up. Nathaniel, Grant continued, was always the only person physically present at any of these auctions. Opening bid prices were consistently set far below the fabricated debt amounts listed on the liens, guaranteeing an easy win with no real competition. And most damning of all, several of the auction paperwork sets bore dates that predated the auctions themselves, proof the outcomes had been decided long before any bidding ever technically took place. Faced with that much documented evidence laid out in front of him, Nathaniel's composure finally cracked. He admitted that Celeste had personally pushed to fast-track the sale of Grant's property, specifically explaining that a real estate development firm was interested in acquiring 3 adjoining parcels of land for a larger commercial project. Grant's home sat at the exact center of that desired parcel, and controlling it would allow Celeste to broker the sale of the entire assembled lot for a projected profit exceeding $4,200,000. In exchange for a reduced role in whatever charges he might eventually face, Nathaniel agreed to fully cooperate with investigators. He turned over a voicemail message he had saved, one in which Celeste's voice could be heard giving direct, explicit instructions. She told him to change the locks before Holloway returned home, explaining that once he saw his belongings thrown out on the lawn, he would understand that everything was already finished and there was nothing left for him to fight. That single recording proved beyond doubt that Celeste had known all along, that Grant had never received any legitimate notice of the proceedings against him. Armed with the voicemail, the spreadsheet, and Nathaniel's cooperation, Monica began preparing a formal search warrant for the association's remaining records and any physical evidence still connected to Celeste directly. Before that warrant could be executed, the association's small administrative office caught fire early the following morning, and Celeste quickly announced to residents that the blaze had destroyed nearly all of the organization's remaining paper records. Celeste insisted publicly that the fire had been a simple electrical accident, an unfortunate coincidence rather than anything deliberate. Russell echoed that same explanation, dismissing any suggestion of arson as baseless speculation designed to further tarnish the association's reputation. Preliminary findings from the fire, investigators told a very different story. The building's smoke detection system had been manually disabled before the fire started, and security camera footage showed the recording system had been switched off a full 17 minutes before any smoke became visible on the remaining footage. Grant remembered Wesley's old video of Celeste and Darlene quietly moving boxes of files out of the office late at night, months before Grant himself had ever become a target. It seemed increasingly clear that the most damaging original documents had likely already been relocated somewhere else long before this fire was ever set, meaning the blaze was less about destroying evidence and more about creating a convenient excuse for its absence. Darlene, still cooperating in hopes of leniency, revealed that Celeste had quietly rented a private storage unit registered under the landscaping company owned by her brother, a location no one would think to connect to the association at all. Monica secured a warrant for that storage unit within days. Inside, investigators found a trove of physical evidence that would prove impossible for Celeste to explain away. They discovered original copies of fine notices that had never actually been mailed to a single homeowner. They found a forged notary stamp used to fake proper legal certification on dozens of documents. They uncovered multiple practice sheets of forged homeowner signatures along with detailed valuation assessments used to determine which properties were most profitable to seize. There was a full copy of the same list identifying vulnerable, isolated homeowners, along with pre-drafted resale contracts prepared long before any of the associated homes had actually been legally seized. And tucked inside a plain manila folder near the back, investigators found the original deed to Grant's own home. Beside the stacked folders sat an industrial paper shredder, along with several unopened bags of shredded material that had never been properly disposed of before the raid arrived. When Russell was brought in for formal questioning, he immediately tried to shift blame entirely onto Celeste, claiming he had merely prepared legal paperwork based on information the association itself had supplied to him. Celeste in turn tried to pin the entire operation on Darlene, painting her former treasurer as a rogue employee, acting without proper authorization. Darlene refused to accept that framing. She produced recorded audio from several private planning sessions recordings, in which Celeste's voice could clearly be heard personally, selecting target properties and setting specific sale prices for each one. Around the same time, Simone published her first major article detailing the scheme, sending a shockwave through the entire Briarcrest community. Longtime residents who had never questioned a single fine began pulling their own records, and many quickly discovered irregularities in charges they had simply paid without ever thinking to challenge them. Even with mounting public pressure, Celeste refused to step down from her position, calling the entire situation a coordinated smear campaign against her and using association funds to hire additional legal representation to fight back. Grant, meanwhile, formally filed a civil lawsuit demanding a comprehensive set of remedies. He sought to void the fraudulent sale of his own home outright to recover every possession that had been damaged or destroyed, to receive compensation for the broader harm caused, to freeze all remaining association bank accounts, to force the surrender of any profits gained through the scheme, and to establish legal protections preventing retaliation against any other homeowner who might come forward with similar claims. The court moved quickly on the request to freeze personal assets belonging to Celeste, Russell, and Darlene while the investigation continued. When the freeze took effect, Celeste discovered with a jolt of genuine panic that all three of the luxury properties purchased with association funds, including her own home, had been placed under direct judicial control pending the outcome of the case. The trial was overseen by Judge Evelyn Mercer, a jurist well known throughout the county for her particular lack of patience when it came to cases involving predatory housing schemes. The courtroom filled well beyond its normal capacity on the first day, packed with former victims, current Briarcrest residents, and members of the local press, eager to see how far the scheme actually reached. Russell opened by arguing that homeowners associations held broad legal authority to manage properties in violation of community rules, and that minor administrative errors in the process should not be enough to invalidate legitimate transactions after the fact. Grant, however, was not simply asking the court to return his own home. Alongside the other victims who had joined the case, he was asking the court to formally recognize the entire operation for what it truly was: a coordinated criminal enterprise disguised behind the ordinary language of neighborhood governance. Claudia Baines took the stand first, walking the court methodically through every irregularity she had discovered in the ownership records, from the expired notary commission to the impossible auction timelines. Monica Hale followed, presenting the physical evidence recovered from the storage unit raid laid out piece by piece for the jury to examine. Nathaniel Crowe admitted openly under oath that the auctions had been staged from start to finish, and that his role had never been anything more than serving as a convenient front for purchases he never actually controlled. Wesley Trent played his old video footage for the courtroom, the grainy nighttime recording of Celeste and Darlene loading boxes of files into a car parked behind the association office. Darlene confirmed under oath that the acquisition schedule spreadsheet had been used specifically by Celeste to select which homeowners would be targeted next. Russell attempted one final counterattack, suggesting that Darlene was simply lying to save herself from prosecution. But Grant countered with a detailed timeline showing that several fraudulent fine documents had been drafted by Russell's office weeks before the board had even formally approved the underlying violations they were supposedly punishing. Eventually, Celeste took the stand herself, insisting throughout her testimony that she had only ever been protecting the value and character of the community she had sworn to serve. She claimed, without apparent shame, that the homeowners who lost their properties simply did not meet what she called the proper standard expected of Briarcrest residents. Judge Mercer interrupted her directly at that point, asking in a voice that cut cleanly through the courtroom exactly what standard could possibly justify forging another person's signature. Celeste had no answer. Grant then presented the voicemail recording, the one capturing Celeste's own voice, instructing Nathaniel to change the locks before Grant could return home, ensuring he would understand everything was already over the moment he saw his belongings scattered on the lawn. Something in Celeste finally broke under the weight of that recording, playing back to the entire room. She turned on Grant, directly accusing him of deliberately setting a trap for her, insisting furiously that his home had rightfully belonged to the association all along because he had failed to properly respect the authority of its governing board. That single outburst, delivered in open court with no filter left to soften it, revealed her true motivation more clearly than any document ever could. The jury saw it, the gathered residents saw it, even Russell sitting beside her visibly flinched. Judge Mercer allowed a long silence to settle over the room before speaking again, telling Celeste plainly that what she had built was not community management in any legitimate sense of the term, but an organized system of property theft carried out under the false authority of an official seal. When the verdict finally came, it did far more than simply return one stolen house to its rightful owner. Judge Mercer declared the sale of Grant's home entirely void from the beginning, ordering Nathaniel to vacate the property immediately and without further delay. Grant's ownership was fully restored, and the court awarded him compensation covering every category of harm he had suffered throughout the ordeal. That compensation included the value of his destroyed furniture and personal belongings, the cost of temporary housing during the months he had been locked out of his own home damages, for the emotional toll of watching his life's possessions thrown into the street lost value from being unable to use or sell his own property during the dispute, the substantial legal costs he had personally absorbed fighting the case, and additional punitive damages meant specifically to punish the deliberate, calculated nature of what had been done to him. The larger complication facing the court was that the association's operating fund had been almost entirely drained by the time the fraud was uncovered, with most of the stolen money already converted into personal assets belonging to Celeste, Russell, and Darlene. Judge Mercer determined that the 3 luxury properties purchased using that stolen money had been bought directly with funds extracted from the very victims now standing before her. And under the legal principle governing the restitution of ill-gotten gains, those properties could not be treated as legitimately belonging to the people who currently held title to them. Celeste's own home was valued at roughly $1,300,000. Russell's property carried a valuation near $980,000. Darlene's smaller home was valued at approximately $760,000. The court ordered that the combined value of these 3 properties, once liquidated, be used to fund restitution payments to all 11 families identified as victims of the scheme. There was, however, one further complication in how that restitution would be structured. Celeste's own home sat directly adjacent to Grant's property, and its location held particular strategic value in restoring the integrity of the land that had originally been targeted for illegal seizure and resale. Under the final restitution agreement approved by the court, Grant was awarded direct ownership of the home that had once belonged to Celeste herself. The remaining 2 properties, belonging to Russell and Darlene, were ordered sold at auction, with the proceeds distributed among the other victims according to the losses each of them had documented. Russell's personal investment accounts were separately seized as part of the broader financial penalty imposed against him. Darlene lost outright ownership of any asset traceable to money taken from the association, though her earlier cooperation with investigators was formally noted as a mitigating factor in her sentencing. The Briarcrest Homeowners Association itself was placed under independent court-appointed management, and every fine issued under Celeste's leadership over the previous 4 years was ordered subject to formal review and potential reversal. Celeste rose from her seat before the bailiff could stop her, insisting loudly that the court had no right to take her personal home away from her. Judge Mercer's response was calm, measured, and utterly final. She told Celeste that she had spent years treating other people's homes as though they were nothing more than currency to be spent however she pleased, and that her own home would now be used to repay exactly what she had taken. Grant showed no visible celebration as the ruling was read aloud. He simply watched Celeste absorb the reality that she now stood exactly where she had once forced him to stand, informed, without warning that she no longer held any right to walk back through her own front door. Shortly after the hearing concluded, deputies escorted Celeste out of the courtroom to face a separate set of criminal charges related to fraud, forgery, and the deliberate destruction of evidence connected to the fire at the association office. In the days that followed, under the direct supervision of court-appointed officials, Grant returned to his original home to reclaim what remained of it. The counterfeit locks were finally removed from the front door, and the sign reading "Sold" was pulled up out of the grass and thrown away for good. Nathaniel had already vacated the property entirely, having agreed to continue cooperating fully as a witness in the ongoing criminal proceedings against his former partners. Much of Grant's furniture had been ruined beyond repair by weeks of exposure to the weather, but neighbors who had once watched silently from their driveways now stepped forward to help him salvage and restore whatever pieces could still be saved. Wesley Trent eventually moved back into the Briarcrest area himself, using a portion of the restitution funds recovered from the sale of Russell and Darlene's properties to secure a new home of his own within the same community he had once been forced to leave. The other identified victims received compensation as well, some through direct reversal of their fraudulent sales where that remained legally possible, others through financial restitution drawn from the liquidated assets of Celeste's inner circle. Grant eventually walked through the home that had once belonged to Celeste after ownership was formally transferred into his name. The interior was lavish throughout, much of it purchased. He now understood clearly, using credit lines tied directly back to the association's stolen funds. In a small office toward the back of the house, Grant found an entire wall covered with a detailed map of the neighborhood dotted with pins and notations marking homes. Celeste had apparently been planning to target next, long before any of this had come to light. He handed that map over to Monica without hesitation, adding it directly to the growing body of evidence being used against Celeste in her criminal trial. Celeste, Russell, and Darlene were all formally charged with multiple felony counts tied directly to the scheme. Darlene's continued cooperation with investigators earned her a somewhat reduced sentence, though the court made clear that her role in the operation still carried real and lasting consequences. Russell permanently lost his license to practice law, ending a career built almost entirely on manipulating the very legal system meant to protect people like Grant. Celeste herself was permanently barred from ever again holding any position involving financial oversight or leadership within a community organization of any kind anywhere in the state. In the aftermath, the Briarcrest Homeowners Association underwent a complete structural overhaul designed to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. Under the new rules put in place, every fine issued by the association would require independent third-party verification before taking effect. No home could ever again be seized or placed under lien without a formal ruling from an actual court of law. Every member of the governing board would now be required to publicly disclose any financial interest connected to association business. All financial records would be subject to a mandatory independent audit conducted every single year without exception. And every resident of the community would be guaranteed direct access to meeting minutes and financial transactions upon request, with no exceptions and no delays. Grant chose not to move into the home that had once belonged to Celeste. Instead, he converted the property into a small legal resource office dedicated to helping homeowners across the county who found themselves facing similar abuses of power from associations meant to serve rather than exploit them. Simone published her final article on the case not long afterward, closing out a story that had taken months to fully unravel from its first quiet thread. In the closing scene of that story, Grant carried a restored wooden chair back onto the front porch of his original home, setting it down carefully in the same spot it had once occupied before everything had been thrown out into the yard. Wesley, standing nearby, asked him whether he finally felt like he had won. Grant looked over at the house next door, the one that had once belonged to Celeste, before answering him honestly. He told Wesley that winning was never really about taking their homes away from them in return. Winning was making absolutely certain that people like them could never again take a home away from anyone else. Behind them, the two properties sat side by side in the fading afternoon light. One home that had once been stolen and fought for its way back, and one home that had become the price finally paid for every act of theft that came before it. Celeste had once believed that a single forged signature was enough to turn Grant's home into something she owned outright. In the end, it was the authentic signature of a judge that turned her own home into the restitution owed to the very man she had tried to throw out into the street.